Recalculating.
Welcome to Recalculating, a podcast about spiritual detours, honest doubt, and the unexpected clarity that comes from questioning the path you're on. I'm Altered Thoughts, and I grew up with one way to believe, one way to belong, one version of God, one direction. But somewhere along the line, the road signs stopped matching the destination, and I had a choice. I could keep relying on the map that had me driving in circles or start asking some different questions. Today, I want to examine one of those questions. What happens when a deeply personal experience, a dream, a vision, evolves into something bigger, something public, something institutional, something beyond even what the dreamer imagined, a revelation? See, I recently got around to a movie that's been sitting in my queue for years, the 2017 Netflix film, The Discovery. Early on in the film, we are introduced to our protagonist, Will, played by Jason Segel. Will is the son of Dr. Thomas Harbour, a scientist played by Robert Redford, who has recently gone public with the claim that he'd proven the afterlife is real. Now, I'll state here that this is not a film making a statement about any particular religion. While the afterlife is seemingly confirmed, it is not called heaven, and there aren't any ministers taking victory laps, as I recall. But there is some proof that death is not the end, that there is a there. The great mystery solved. Now, what is the afterlife? Is it the same for everyone? These questions are still unknowns, but is death final? No. That much, for Dr. Harbour, was no longer a question of faith, but an actuality, a certainty. But instead of bringing peace to the world or validation to religions, mass conversions, or even a global exhalation of collective anxiety, society almost immediately begins to unravel. This discovery, in removing the mortal question from the human psyche, for those that believe Dr. Harbour at least, leads to mass suicides. Not from individuals that were previously suicidal, but because they believed that they were headed somewhere better, somewhere proven. There was no longer an if, just the destination. Within what appears to be a year or so, millions of people, desperate to get there, as it's called in the film, wherever their conception of there was, choose to leave this life behind. Knowing they would be going to another life left them no reason to continue suffering in this one. That proof brought them comfort, in a sense. But for the rest of society, those that didn't believe Dr. Harbour, those that didn't want to pursue their next life, or those who simply continued living this one as they had before, for them it brought chaos. Families were split apart, children left behind. Survivors of their attempts to get there, but failed and stayed here, were left with those they tried to abandon. Eventually, after a publicly televised suicide during an interview of Dr. Harbour, where he is disavowing any culpability in these deaths, he ends up going underground and building a commune of followers intrigued by his research as he continues to find a way to record his proof. Will, his son, spends most of the film trying to undo the damage his father's work has unleashed on the world, while also getting to know a woman named Isla because it's Hollywood. Now, we learn from Will's interactions with Isla that it's not Dr. Harbour who initially discovered the truth about the afterlife. It was Will. After an accident when he was 5 years old left him dead for 1 minute, Will had an experience. And what he remembers from that experience when he wakes up is a scattered dream, fragments of something. But as a 5-year-old, recounting and surviving a traumatic experience to traumatized parents, he claims he embellished it along the way, not intentionally, maybe not even consciously initially. Nor is he clear on what was embellished about his dream, but Isla asks why he would do such a thing, and he says, I think it is our instinct to search for meaning, and when there is none, it is our instinct to create meaning, and we lie to ourselves. Will isn't sure what he saw or what he remembers, but his father is. The feel you get is his father's research all stems from this story that Will told him when he woke up at 5 years old. Proving the certainty of this experience became his father's life's work. As a father, I think I can understand that, being so shaken by something happening to your child that getting to the bottom of it or sharing the blessing from it becomes your only focus. But for Dr. Harbour, it became an all-consuming obsession, one where he neglected everything else in his life, including his wife, who ultimately took her own life. This pursuit of the son's dream cost the mother's life. Capturing the dream cost millions more of them. The movie progresses, balancing the perspectives of this father and son to determine whether or not this discovery really has been proven, and if so, is the world ready for it? In the end, we're left with the question, not so much what was the discovery, but should it ever have been public? Now, that's not necessarily the main plot point. I've spoiled nothing for you if you want to watch the film. Nothing that isn't fairly evident from the opening scenes. There's actually a tremendous twist on top of a twist and an open enough ending to debate exactly how it ended and what happened. I would actually suggest watching it twice because most of the dialogue takes on new meaning after you know how the film ends. It's as mind-bending as you want it to be. But the initial cause of conflict, what was Will's dream? What should have been done with it? Was it up to Will? Should it have been? All of that got me thinking about Ellen White and the founding of the Adventist Church. In 1844, Ellen White, still then Ellen Harmon, was 17 with a third-grade education. She had survived a traumatic brain injury at the age of 9 when a classmate hit her with a rock-packed snowball. In her years dealing with the injury, the educational setbacks that it caused, and the lasting disfigurement, all potentially exacerbated by her having a twin sister, she was plagued with fearful dreams of damnation and hellfire. Retribution she saw for her anger about her situation. She felt like God had given up on her to be lost and may even find joy in the suffering she was experiencing. She records these fears multiple times in her early days, waking up in the night crying out in terror, dreams of angels abandoning her, that she was beyond forgiveness, trapped on one side of an impassable gulf, separated by those that God loved, entering temples with the saints only to be left alone in the darkness, always on the outside, awaiting punishment, and wake up to find it was all a dream. In her teen years, she joins the Millerite movement, becoming fully convinced that the end of the world is imminent, and Christ is soon to return to execute the judgment she'd been dreaming of, a movement where people left everything else that had been known to them behind, just like the people at Dr. Harbour's commune. People who sold their homes, quit their jobs, or didn't plant in the summer because they knew Jesus would return before the harvest in the fall. A movement where Ellen finally felt saved. But Judgment Day came and it went, and she, along with the others, suffered the great disappointment. These people, these Millerites who'd spent years preparing for the fulfillment of their prophecy of Jesus' return, and now prophecy failed. She was surrounded by people searching for meaning in what seemed like God abandoning them, or that they'd been deceived. But she had another dream. Another large crowd, another terrible gulf, more fear of falling, but this time she and her friends were the ones on the path, not almost falling. This dream she shared became more than a dream. It became her first vision, a deeply emotional, symbolic experience, a narrow path to salvation, a light shining on those who believed what she believed. the light going out for those that didn't. And this dream from this child became something more. Others built doctrines and fundamental beliefs around it. Her husband, James, Hiram Edson, Joseph Bates, and others. Eventually, their beliefs, their interpretations of Scripture informed her mind and her dreams, and they became more than their parts. Eventually, an entire denomination is born, a new gospel, the everlasting gospel, and the investigative judgment. But like in the discovery, the dream that started it all is not what the legacy of the dream became. These initial visions, the imagery, divine inspiration conveyed on her after the disappointment, don't validate the investigative judgment or Sabbatarianism or any other foundational belief in Seventh-day Adventism. They aren't predictions. They don't explain Scripture in any way, shape, or form. Actually, if you think about it, her first visions aren't even all that great, even for Seventh-day Adventists. In the first 2 months after the Great Disappointment, she was taken in vision, high up above the earth, which was in darkness. She looked for the Advent people down on the earth and saw none, but a voice told her to look higher, where she saw a straight and narrow path leading to a bright and holy city. The path to the city was lit beginning at the midnight cry, and Jesus was at the other end. Now, the midnight cry at the time in Millerite belief was believed to be the previous time that they had thought Jesus was coming in the prior spring. As long as the Advent people kept focused on Jesus at the end of the path, they were safe. Now, after a little while, some of the Advent people grew tired, believing that they should have entered the city by now, but Jesus encouraged them with a light from his arm. But some began to believe that the light from the path was not God's doing. For them, the light fell away, and they could no longer see where to step, and they fell back into the dark world. Then the voice of God tells the remaining Advent people, now dwindled down to a tidy 144,000, the exact day and hour of Jesus' coming. One of the things the Bible expressly says, no one will know. Now, in this vision, no one on the path was not part of the Advent people. There was no way to reach the path if you weren't already on it. There was no way back to the path once you fell off it, signifying that only the Millerites were even qualified for this path to salvation. What was left after the doubters, after the backsliders, is the symbolic 144,000 number, indicating that the 144,000 from the Bible represents only the Millerites who keep the faith despite the great disappointment. Now, in 2025, most Adventists don't even identify with the Millerite movement anymore. Yet, according to the vision, then a few months later, she has a second one. It expands on the first. She sees the Father and the Son seated together on a throne with all humanity gathered around them. There's the Advent people, there's the Christian church, and then there's the rest of the world. But everyone falls into one of two groups. There's one group kneeling in prayer, deeply engaged, and the rest are standing around disinterested. The praying group looks to Jesus. Jesus turns to his Father and pleads on their behalf. Then a light shines from the Father to the Son and then to the praying group. Then a brighter light follows that same path and washes over everyone. But some immediately run from it because of its brightness. Others remain indifferent, disinterested, and the light eventually leaves them. But some, even in this disinterested party, join the little praying group in response. Then, in a dramatic shift, the Father gets up and he moves into the most holy place in a chariot of fire, and Jesus follows. most of the praying company get up and follow him. Some that were there before the light, some that are new. But here's the disturbing part. The light from Jesus does not return to the disinterested or the interested crowds once he leaves. They're left in complete darkness from then on. The group that remained praying, deeply engaged, that were still kneeling, but unaware that Jesus has left, continue praying. But now Satan is standing where Jesus had been. And these faithful believers who had been sincerely praying to Jesus just a moment before are now unknowingly praying to Satan, receiving false power from him to deceive everyone else. In this vision, the implication is chilling. By rejecting the message that time was up when the Millerites were delivering it, a message that was proclaimed over 180 years ago, the remaining followers of Jesus in all of their denominational forms were unwittingly under satanic influence. A vision unlocked in time as a message from God, with certainty, infallibility, a universal truth. And here's what I keep coming back to. What if her dream was never meant to become a vision, was never meant to be a movement? What if it was meant for her, not for the world? What if it was just a dream? What if there is something between dream and truth? Both the discovery and early Adventism wrestle with this core question. What happens when mystery of the unknown is replaced with certainty of the unconfirmable? In the film, Will did see something when he was 5 years old. Dr. Harbour does record something later, but the disconnect is the assumptions everyone brings into their experience. Proof of something isn't proof of what Dr. Harbour thought. He had preconceived notions and motives. Something happened to his son. His wife left this plane of existence because of his obsession with what happened to his son. He needs there to be something. He needs certainty. But in the film, finding it leads to death, which begs the question, what role was faith supposed to play inside of this world? And Dr. Harbour says something wildly profound at one point in the film. He says, "Show me someone who relies on faith, and I'll show you someone who's given up control over whatever it is that they believe." The irony of him saying this is he exclaims it in the middle of a room filled with a community built around believing in him. Faith in the afterlife became a certainty by way of transferring that faith to Dr. Harbour. Belief in what he discovered gave millions of people enough certainty in the afterlife to go there immediately. They gave control of what they believed to him. But I see ideas of faith and belief opposite of Dr. Harbour. To me, he's describing certainty. Certainty is giving up control of belief for the conclusions of another. It's the opposite of faith. However, in Adventism, as in the discovery, acceptance of that certainty can make you withdraw, not from life in Adventism, but from life as you knew it. A social death of sorts to get ready to stay ready. Many friendships end. The types of jobs you can take dwindle. How you act, dress, how you speak becomes homogenized. You disappear into the Adventist version of you, physically and spiritually dressed for the job you want, not the one you have. Everything becomes about being ready to get there. And if it's not about getting there, then it's going to get in the way of you getting there. The cost is not literal death, nor is it immediate. It's quieter, slower. Death of mystery, curiosity, and wonder. The death of self-trust, intuitive spirit. The death of alternatives, perspectives, and interpretive choice. People disappear into a bubble, a life of belief chosen for them by the need to find meaning in someone else's dream. A dream not wrapped in divine language or revealing something divine of nature, but a need for identity, institutionalized by further traumatized men. Before you even get to the question of whether or not Ellen's dreams could have had divine origins, who asked the question of whether or not they were meant for universal application, even within a single denomination? The dreams became visions when they began to reflect the group's developing beliefs. Then they became truths, and those truths became our burden. In both the discovery and the early Adventist movement, someone else's experience is fused with an unmovable, deeply subjective moment that is adopted, interpreted, defined, and then systematized as universal truth. For Dr. Harbour, it's the embellished childhood near-death memory of his son, blended with the grief of losing his wife. For early Adventists, it's Ellen Harmon, a teenager, disappointed and dismissed, and a dream turned vision by the trauma of prophecy seeming to fail. Neither origin was malicious. Both began in trauma. Both were rooted in longing for certainty and salvation. But in both cases, the subjective becomes objective too quickly. A child's dream, misunderstood or misremembered, becomes the foundation of a scientific movement. It becomes bigger than the dreamer and launches a new faith into existence. Likewise, a teenage girl's desire for inclusion, for purpose in what she believed was the end of the world, becomes the blueprint for the remnant church, a denomination defined by its distinction from the rest of Christianity. The quiet tragedy is this: neither dream was allowed to be simply personal. Once it was shared, others built temples around them. Temples of data, temples of doctrine, and those temples began to shape reality for everyone else. This, I fear, is the danger of secondhand certainty. Will's memory wasn't questioned, it was cherished and institutionalized, even though Will himself wasn't sure what it was. Not whether or not he had it, but what it was, what it meant. Ellen's visions weren't interpreted as one traumatized girl's inner processing. Her visions were canonized. The personal became public, the intimate became instructional, and in both stories, the fallout is seismic. In the discovery, millions of people die before their time. In Adventism, the rest of the world is condemned. There's a line in the discovery that has never left me. Isla, after hearing Will's hesitation about the truth of his memories, responds not with a challenge, but with a kind of sorrowful empathy. She says something like, "But even if you don't believe it anymore, other people did." That, I think, is the hardest part to turn from. What begins as a fragile hope, a way to keep breathing after grief, can metastasize into a dogma that stops others from breathing at all. Now, I don't think personally that Ellen White was even trying to start a religion. I think she was a teenager trying to make sense of her grief, her body, and her thoughts about God. I'm not certain her early visions were anything more than symbolic language for survival in the wake of the Great Disappointment. But the machine that grew up around her and the certainty that came along with it changed the story. Just like in the discovery, the moment the insight becomes public, it stops being tender. It stops being human. It stopped being one person's experience. It becomes a doctrine, a demand, a system, one far from whatever its original intent could have been. Arthur White, Ellen's grandson, said this of the discovery of the investigative judgment. Without this light, those who lived through the 1844 experience, would have been left in darkness. But with it, They saw that prophecy had not failed, and their faith in their guiding hand of God was restored. But the truth is, the investigative judgment took over a decade to develop, a decade where that date in 1844 had no certain meaning. And I think it is our instinct to search for meaning. Without Ellen White's dreams being the proof of the presence of God in the group, in the search for that meaning, there'd be no spiritual bridge from the Millerite movement to the Adventist church, no redemption for the great disappointment, just another interpretive choice. With it, they become the remnant. People needed answers, and her dreams became clay in the hands of others. Clay in her own hands, shaped into prophecy, policy, assimilation, homogenization of foods, clothing, education, entertainment, a codification of truth, etched in stone as if from atop Mount Sinai. I wonder if this is how all certainty works, forming like cooled lava, starting out fluid, symbolic, open to interpretation, rich with meaning, but only for a little while. Then it hardens into something immovable, something unyielding. Now there's a whole community living on top of it, forgetting it was started by a fire. In the discovery, we never find out exactly what the afterlife is. The evidence ultimately obtained is not heaven. It's not a memory, it's something else. It wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't what Dr. Harbour was convinced it was, nor his followers. They raced still into the unknown. Ellen's early visions weren't about a literal future. They were highly symbolic. They were geared to making sense for her, of her then and there, the time she was in. Those initial visions didn't promise clarity or certainty, but they were adopted by people that needed them to. They became signs of the way to get there. So people rearranged their lives, remade their identities, divided their families, created boundaries defining the remnant just the right size for themselves, perfectly tailored. Throwing up walls, casting the rest of the Christian expression as apostate fallen Babylon. Worshippers of the sun, cheapeners of grace, all in the pursuit of certainty in getting there. But for a moment, let's ask the questions. What if Will's memory had been allowed to fade? What if Ellen's dreams had been allowed to stay dreams? What if instead of questioning the reality of sacred things, the sacred things we experience are simply not meant for others to believe? Maybe not even meant for us to fully understand. And why would this diminish the experience? What makes this lesser revelation? What if these moments are to be protected from misuse, from the potential of them being weaponized by those that weren't there, or by ourselves as the heat cools and the lava hardens? Both stories are about people trying to live inside someone else's revelation, someone else's dream that maybe wasn't properly understood in the first place. And maybe that's what we're still doing. Always trying to find our way through worlds shaped by dreams we didn't dream, certainties we aren't certain of. Maybe we've simply given up control over whatever it is that we believe. There's a liberating hope in this. If the dream was not meant for us, maybe it is up to us to choose how much of it we continue to carry. Maybe the burden was never ours. Maybe the pursuit of getting there gets in the way of being here, and for now, what else can we be? Maybe sometimes a dream is just a dream, and maybe that's enough. I don't know. I'm just recalculating. If this episode stirred something in you, a memory, a question, a breath of relief. I hope you aren't alone, and I'd love for you to share this episode with someone else who's carrying heavy things, or leave a review if you found this little detour helpful. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. The world is lighter than they told us. I'm Altered Thoughts.
Recalculating.